Now we're going to finish up the book of Joshua today. But before we get there, we're going to look at a few more of the inspiring, foundational, rather heavy-duty God principles that comprise the last chapter of this book. Now, I suspect we could spend even more weeks in this lone chapter 24. And I think, as I told you in earlier lessons, some scholars have made a goodly portion of their careers studying and reporting on Joshua chapter 24. Now, we're going to be examining the 15th to the 20th verses of this 24th and final chapter. Rather, we were examining that when we ended our last lesson. And this was the matter whereby Joshua asked the people which God they intended to serve. What an interesting question. And when they said they would serve Jehovah, Joshua thought about their answer. And he said to them, sorry, you can't serve God. Now that would be a startling answer from your leader, wouldn't it? Let's reread a few verses to kind of get our bearings. Find out why Joshua would provide such a surprising and negative retort. So open your Bibles to Joshua chapter 24. We're going to start at verse 15. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it is page 268. Joshua chapter 24, starting at verse 15. If it seems bad to you to serve Adonai, then choose today whom you're going to serve. Will it be the gods your ancestors served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living? Well, as for me and my household, we will serve Adonai. The people answered, far be it from us that we would abandon Adonai to serve other gods, because it is Adonai our God who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt, from a life of slavery, and did those great signs before our eyes, preserved us all along the way we traveled and among all the peoples we passed through. And it was Adonai who drove out from ahead of us all the peoples, the Amorites living in the land. Therefore we too will serve Adonai, because he is our God. Joshua said to the people, you can't serve Adonai, because he's a holy God, a jealous God. He'll not forgive your crimes and sins. If you abandon Adonai and serve foreign gods, he will turn, doing you harm, destroying you after all the good he's done, after all he has done you good. All right, as we work our way through this difficult but enlightening passage, we discovered that an ironic problem, cosmic proportions, was put before Israel for their consideration, and that when read casually, sounds like crazy-making words, because it also sounds like an absolute and divine insistence that the impossible happen. Simply stated, the problem is this. God demands that those who call themselves by his name, those who say they are part of his people, that they serve him with fullest devotion and perfection. But since no man is even capable of such devotion or perfection, something Jehovah well understands, then what the Lord demands of Israel, they cannot do. So, Joshua tells Israel in verse 19, you can't serve Jehovah. I hope you see this. God says, I want you to do what you can't do, and if you don't, you're going to suffer the curses and destruction. What are we supposed to think of such a thing? What are we to think of such a God that would demand the contradictory? I mean, it's no wonder that we find Israel's response almost kindergarten in nature and really pretty hollow. This was because they couldn't comprehend the depth of the question that the Lord, through Joshua, asked of them. The level of devotion and service that God demands of his own is total and without flaw. That's because he is holy. He is perfect, and therefore he can accept no less from his subjects, or it would be defilement towards him. You see, it was rather easy for Israel to serve these false gods that had infiltrated their camp. You make a little statue out of wood or stone, drip some oil on them, bow towards them, pray to them, lay a little fine food before them. And these non-gods seemed perfectly happy. I mean, which of these idols was going to tell you you're not worshiping them properly? It was somewhat different as concerned dealing with the Almighty God who created all things, Jehovah. The very first man ever created failed in his devotion to the Creator. Abraham couldn't do it either. Moses couldn't achieve the required level of perfection of service to God. Therefore, Jehovah punished him by not allowing him to enter the promised land. Now, if Adam, Abraham, and Moses couldn't serve the Lord properly, how could a common Hebrew farmer or herdsman be expected to do such a thing? Answer, Joshua says it can't be done. On the other hand, God expects it. And he says, you should expect it of yourselves. In case it hasn't struck you, it is this same absurd proposition, absurd sounding proposition, that is the reason that Yeshua, our Messiah, was necessary. And there is no way that he could have been only a mere man, because no mere man was even remotely capable of perfect service to the Creator. As a result of sin, all men are doomed to this failure. And in a sense, so are all believers. I mean, even more aggravating is that as long as the pagans, those who have never known God, leave Israel alone, God says he'll leave them alone. But Israel catches no such break from the Lord. I mean, in another cosmic irony, it is that the people who God separates out and he elects to be his own chosen people, we will be more scrutinized and expected to achieve a higher standard than those who he's not chosen and selected out. Pagans who follow other gods will not necessarily have evil dumped on their heads. But if Israel fails as God's chosen people, he says, you will. They will. So here we have in the book of Joshua the dynamic established that requires nothing less than for the Lord to come and himself solve the insolvable dilemma that man has caused and cannot cure, but also one that God will accept no compromise. Now, continuing that same thought, when we back up to verse 15, we find one of the more important words. It really amounts to a self-contained concept in this chapter, and the word is choose. Choose inherently implies what? Free will. The ability to choose. Choosing is only possible when there's a clear distinction between two or more possibilities and the liberty is available to make a choice. The choice presented to Israel is choose the God of Israel or choose other gods. Choose. And while that question seems somewhat benign, in fact, it's the Chinese fingers of all questions that will ever be put before Israel or before any of us, for that matter. You know what Chinese fingers are, right? Got a picture of them here. It's this simple little device. Very simple. And you put your fingers in it, one from each side usually. But a problem develops when you try to extract them. When you try to take your fingers out of this device, it grabs hold and won't let you. And the harder you pull and the more you panic, the tighter the Chinese fingers grip. And no amount of human strength or thrashing about releases you. You're trapped. I mean, I have watched people panic when they realize their predicament. The moral of this is one that the typical Christian is startled to hear. To choose to serve the Lord is dangerous. And the consequences are serious. To choose to serve Jehovah means you stuck your fingers into the infinitely powerful Chinese fingers of the God of the universe. And once you're in, getting out is not only difficult, but it will certainly probably mean at least your destruction, should you succeed. This is what was behind Joshua's question, and Israel just didn't get it. So they answered in a childlike ignorance, having little idea of what this choice meant that they had made before God. As is stated, they were doing it before God in verse 1. And of what the repercussions of their choice, either choice they made, was going to be. Now there's yet another mighty principle that's interwoven throughout this marvelous theological essay that's Joshua 24. It is that as little chance that we have of succeeding, God's believers are to constantly strive to emulate God in every way. God is merciful, we are to show mercy. God is loving, we are to show love. God is patient, faithful, and slow to anger. We should demonstrate those same attributes. The Lord has established his justice. We are to establish his justice. God chose Israel from his free will to be his people. So Israel is free to choose Jehovah or not from their free will to be their God. Yeshua chose to give his life for ours from his own free will. Now we are free to choose to give our lives to him or not from our own free will. But here's the thing. Everything changes when we're confronted with that choice. When Joshua challenged Israel with this question, Israel was in the midst of renewing their commitment to the covenant of Moses. This question was at the heart of that renewal process there at Shechem. When we finally understand there is a choice, and we choose not to give our lives to him, then the only life we'll ever have is this oh so short physical earthly one, followed by a long period of torment and regret, and then judgment. But when we choose to give our lives to him, then we'll live as he lives, eternally in paradise. even by our acceptance of God's Son, we cannot escape so easily from the problem of the Chinese fingers any more than Israel did here at Shechem. See, the sticky issue is that those who have never known God are generally permitted by His will to have as good a life as they can make on their own. The main exception to that being those who might come against God's people, and then all bets are off. Those who we call pagans have never experienced the Lord. They've never received His blessings. They've never laid down in His rest. They've never been showered in His shalom. They've not known Him. So, they have not been initiated into the kingdom of God. They're not familiar with the Word of God, His laws, His commands, and they have no idea they need a Messiah. Practically nothing is expected of these people by the Lord. In fact, a number of passages in both the Old and New Testaments explain that it's perfectly natural for pagans to worship the sun and the moon and the stars as gods because the Father put those objects in the sky for just such a purpose. But those who know God, know His laws and commandments, are experiencing His love and His grace. In Joshua's era, that included those Israelites who watched the Lord part the Red Sea, watched the Lord rain food from the sky, watched the Lord burst forth water from boulders to sustain them, then crossed a dammed-up Jordan River and marvel as the Father destroyed the vast enemy armies ahead of them, finally gave them rest in their own land. These same people who the Lord redeemed and by definition knew Him, agreed they have obligations to Him. And their obligations all centered on serving Him because that is precisely what they were set apart to do. And dear friends, that is what all believers in Yeshua, our Messiah, Jesus Christ, were chosen by Him to do. Serve Him. That's our jobs. You, me, Gentiles, Jews, all disciples of Yeshua. We were elected with a purpose to serve the Lord with unwavering devotion and with 100% perfection. Now, naturally, we'll never achieve that on this side of heaven. Nonetheless, that's what we're to strive for. We're supposed to give it our best shot until our lungs suck in that last breath of air. God gave Israel the Torah in order to know what perfect service looked like. How else are they going to know? How else are we going to know? And then He also gave them a sacrificial system so that they could be forgiven when they failed. But with each failure, a new sacrifice was needed. With each failure, their iniquities piled up and then were passed on to the next generation to bear. With every careless act, with every imperfection, with every divided devotion, another innocent animal lost its life. With Yeshua came the last sacrifice needed, the perfect one with perfect devotion. With Yeshua, every past failure could be forgiven and every future failure atoned for in advance. The cosmic problem set before Israel in this chapter of Joshua was only solved 1,300 years after the problem was posed. We don't stop failing in our service to God just because we're saved, but we're supposed to try. Yeah, it's exhausting. It is. However, it's not physical rest that was promised to us. It was spiritual and eternal rest. Yes, we can get disappointed in our failures. We can be very upset with the failures of others who are our Christian leaders, our messianic friends, our believing families. I mean, tears and bitterness are normal in these earthly shells. But we can also know with joy that this will last only for a little while. Then we're going to experience eternal shalom, peace and well-being in God's presence. Now, as wonderful as all this is, what happens to those who are redeemed and have known God, but inexplicably choose to serve another master instead of Jehovah? Does the Lord wink and nod, look the other way? Does Israel, as God's people, get the equivalent of a short time out in their rooms for breaking faith with the Lord? Verse 20 answers that awful question. If you abandon Adonai and you serve foreign gods, he will turn, doing you harm, destroying you, after he's done you good. That scare you at all? It scares me. I know that some of you who are listening believe that this situation and God principle doesn't even exist anymore. And that as a follower of God, all you can ever expect from him is his goodness and mercy, no matter what choices we make. And indeed, for so long as you are his, safely gripped with those heavenly Chinese fingers, I have no doubt this is so. But free will and choice did not end for God's people after their redemption from Egypt, nor after decades and decades of them experiencing the Lord firsthand in the wilderness and then in Canaan. I see no evidence that it is any different in our current era, and we're cautioned about this over and over by Yeshua and his disciples. I'm well aware of the controversial nature of this issue, and that reasonable and godly people can disagree about it. But those who have known God and then renounce him, those who determine to extract themselves from his kingdom must be, without doubt, the most miserable people on this earth. Because the God of Israel says he's not going to give you up without a fight. This is not going to be, I think I'm out of here. And he says, okay, bye. This battle for your soul is going to mean a lot of pain for you. God will pursue you. He will discipline and chastise you if you think to change your loyalties to another master. This is because you're so valuable to him. He will never allow a human being. He will never permit a creature or a spirit to take you out of his hand. You're his. But according to Joshua 24, and by the way, according to the parable of the seeds in Luke chapter 8, by your own free will, you can choose the way of destruction after you've chosen the way of goodness and mercy for a while. How could any rational person make such a crazy choice? We can ask that question. Well, how could any Israelite who personally witnessed God's spectacular and visible miracles choose to serve another and lesser God? Yet this was not a rhetorical question the Lord asked of Israel through Joshua when he wanted to know whom they were going to serve. Thousands of Israelites were at that very moment secretly harboring Canaanite idols in their homes. Mystery Babylon gods and goddesses in their hearts. In a few short years, thousands more would openly devote themselves to El, Ashtaroth, Baal, and Astarte. We're going to begin reading about this shockingly rapid decline of Israel into rampant idolatry in the book of Judges, which we start next week. Let's read a little bit more of Joshua 24. We're going to read verses 21 through 28. But the people said to Joshua, "No, but we will serve Adonai." And Joshua said to the people, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen Adonai to serve him." They answered, "We are witnesses." Now Joshua urged, "Put away the foreign gods that you have among you. Turn your hearts to Adonai, the God of Israel." And the people answered Joshua, "We will serve Adonai our God. We will pay attention to what he says." So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, laying down for them laws and rulings there in Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the Torah of God. And then he took a big stone and he set it up there under the oak tree, under the oak next to the sanctuary of Adonai. And Joshua said to all the people, "See, this stone will be a witness against us because it has heard all the words of Adonai which he said to us. Therefore it will be a witness against you in case you deny your God." Then Joshua sent the people away, every man to his inheritance. So after Joshua explains that if Israel serves any foreign gods, thereby breaking faith with the Lord, there's going to be severe penalties, the worst of which is the reversal of their salvation history. He will harm them. He will destroy them. But the people respond even more firmly. They will not forsake Jehovah and serve foreign gods. Now, what's troubling is what they did not say. They did not say that they would forsake foreign gods. They did not agree to bury, so to speak, their idols and be rid of them. Rather, they only agreed not to abandon the Lord God in favor of those other gods. In their minds, this means they could have other gods as long as they continued to worship Jehovah. And here is the problem that Israel has faced for the entire term of existence. And here is the problem for which they have suffered at God's hand greatly. And fellow believers, this is what we suffer from too. Verse 22 says something that seems innocuous to most moderns, but it had a significant meaning to the ancients. Yeshua now accepts Israel's answer that it will serve God after he had rejected the same answer earlier, and then adds a warning. You are a witness against yourselves. Now, I taught in earlier lessons that the nature of what a witness is, what a witness does back then, is quite different in Western culture and law than it was in Hebrew culture and the law of Moses. For us, a witness is merely someone who can testify to some aspect of a judicial case. Their only obligation is to be truthful. But a witness in ancient Israel was also an accuser, a prosecutor, and if the offense required the death penalty, then they had to be the ones who began the execution process. They were the first to throw a stone in a stoning. And then the remainder of the community, who weren't the witnesses, would follow suit. So what Joshua is assuming is the role of a judge. And he's swearing in Israel as witnesses against themselves. Joshua is telling Israel, and they fully understand, that as witnesses against themselves, if they should commit idolatry, which according to the law requires the death penalty for conviction, they will be their own accusers, their own prosecutors, and they will execute themselves, so to speak. That is, they'll be the cause of their own destruction. To commit idolatry is to commit spiritual suicide, which will lead to earthly punishment. They agree to these terms. And so in verse 25, Joshua commands them one last time, get rid of those god idols. Get rid of them. You have hidden in your tents, in your hearts. Serve only the God of Israel. And Israel again asserts she fully understands her vow, the seriousness of her obligation to Jehovah, what the consequences for failure might be. They pledge to Shema, the Lord. They pledge, this means they pledge not only to hear Jehovah, but to obey what they hear. Now, every new covenant or renewal of an existing covenant necessarily invokes making a vow. Now that the people have publicly vowed to serve the Lord, forsake other gods, and to listen to the Lord and obey what he tells them, the process is now completed. Their promise to the Lord and his to them is now in effect. And to memorialize that covenant renewal, Joshua erects a standing stone as a witness to all that happened. Now, the second half of verse 26 is significantly problematic in a number of ways. First is this matter of the standing stone placed under the big oak tree, likely the same place that Jacob buried his clan's idols. The Hebrew word for what we call a standing stone in English is eben gadol, and it means a great stone. It's essentially synonymous with another Hebrew word, masabot, although there's very minor differences. These are both ceremonial stones that are used within a religious context. They were used among pagans to mark holy sites, times to honor several of their gods. They were also symbolic of an appearance of a god or goddess at that spot, or they were to commemorate a historically important act of a deity. Usually they were set up on a high place, a hill or a mound, and whenever possible, underneath a tree. Now, the use of standing stones and trees was as central and common to worship practices among pagans as is Christians sitting in pews, all right, listening to a pastor speak from a raised pulpit while standing under a wooden cross. Yet, was Joshua's and Israel's sincere effort to erect a stone monument to that special moment there at Shechem the proper thing to do? Obviously, they thought it was. We're going to find all throughout Israel's history this act of commemorating their commitment to God by means of a stone monument placed under a large tree. Now, you can put whipped cream on a pile of dirt, but it's still a pile of dirt. This tree had a meaning that Israel knew about. They just chose to ignore it and feel that since they didn't necessarily attach the same meaning, then it was fine to employ trees in their religious practices. Among the pagans, the tree was a symbol for the wife of El. The tree was typically called an Asherah, the wife Ashtaroth. Ashtaroth was the mother god. And tree symboled, therefore, new life. It was an element of fertility. Thus, groves of trees that were used in pagan shrines were called in Hebrew Asherah. So Asherah in the Bible is both the formal name of El's wife, and the word comes out of that, and the word used for a sacred grove of trees. The point being, this wasn't lost on the Hebrews. They full well know the meaning of employing a tree on a hill in a religious ceremony and who was being honored. Even if they didn't necessarily overtly intend to honor a pagan goddess, all who were not Hebrews took it that way. But have no doubt, the Israelites were also hedging their bets. By worshiping the Lord God using practices and methods that the other gods enjoyed, you're killing two birds with one stone. And you're not offending your pagan neighbors. After all, there was always that chance that those Canaanite gods were still around, and let's not aggravate them. The problem is, they were violating both the letter and the spirit of the Torah. Leviticus 26:1. You are not to make yourselves any idols, erect a carved statue or a standing stone, or place any carved stone anywhere in your land in order to bow down to it. I'm Adonai, your God. I want to repeat this verse, adding in a couple of Hebrew words to replace their English translations to help you understand just how crystal clear this commandment of God is to avoid using stones as monuments to Him. You are not to make yourselves any idols, erect a carved statue or a masabot, or place an Eben Gadol anywhere in your land in order to bow down to it. I am Jehovah your God. No masabot, no Eben. Both terms commonly used to convey using a stone to mark a religious or a holy site were employed in this well-known commandment. There was no doubt. And the biblical writers who wrote in later times came down hard on this continued practice by Israel of using religious standing stones placed under sacred trees. There is equally no doubt that Israel constantly used stones and trees in a misguided attempt to please God. They were used unthinkingly, perhaps innocently, because their use was so traditional within Middle Eastern cultures. But it was wrong. And such seemingly innocent, though sincere acts invariably lead baby step by baby step to more careless and serious trespasses against the Lord's commandments, and until God justly punishes the violators. Shock and surprise is often their first reaction when they suddenly feel God's wrath. And I greatly fear that we believers today, we are such careless people in our frivolous attempts to supposedly honor Jehovah, when in fact we're far more interested in making a personal statement or just pleasing ourselves. We, as did Israel, still think we can take a forbidden pagan practice and on our own accord merely attach a different meaning to it. And then offer it to the Lord. And then say, oh, He's going to be pleased with this. It's one thing for Jehovah to ordain a practice in the Torah that might seem similar to those used by pagans who do not worship Him, and He attaches a different and heavenly meaning to it. It's quite another thing to think that we have the authority to do that. Well, another problematic issue in verse 26 is where it says that the standing stone was placed under a tree and next to the sanctuary of Jehovah. Oh my. I mean, the obvious question is, did the tabernacle get moved from Shiloh to Shechem for a time? Or, as is more often believed, did perhaps the Ark of the Covenant get transported to Shechem for this ceremony and then it was returned to Shiloh? As difficult as either of those possible solutions is, there's yet another possibility that's perhaps even more troubling. It is known that in that same area there was a pagan sanctuary to the god Baal. It was operated by the Canaanite residents of Shechem and called Baal Berith, or the covenant of Baal. It is just possible that these Israelites took over this sanctuary and converted it to a sanctuary to Jehovah. for an enemy, in this case Israel, to capture a sanctuary to a certain god that belonged to their opponent and then rededicate that sanctuary to a different god, one of their gods, that was a common, understood, normal operating procedure in that era. And that may well be what happened here. Now, naturally, it would seem to have been a wrong thing for Joshua and Israel to do, but just like the trees and the standing stones, they didn't see it that way. We're going to find this exact same thing happening during the time of the Maccabees, when the temple of God in Israel, in Jerusalem, was captured by Syria. They converted it to a sanctuary to Zeus. And when Israel recaptured it, recaptured it, they rededicated it to Jehovah. I mean, you see this happen in history. You know, a few years ago, my wife and I spent some time in Spain. And we visited some of the great cities of the Spanish Southlands. And there were some magnificent cathedrals at the center of each of these cities. But in a couple of cases, these enormous grand cathedrals were nothing more than converted mosques and places of the Muslim rulers who had conquered most of Spain in the 7th century AD and controlled it for a couple hundred years. When Christians retook Spain, or more specifically, it was the Catholic Church who represented Christianity, then rather than tear down these magnificent houses of worship and palaces of the Muslims, the church simply took them as is and rededicated them to the Christian God. In England today, it's common for Muslims to purchase long-defunct churches and rededicate them to Allah as mosques. We have exactly the same thing going on in the USA as I speak. So this concept of converting a sanctuary of worship dedicated to one God into a place of worship to a different God was not only usual thousands of years ago, it remains so to this day, even in the West. I will tell you, you may not know this, right down US 1 in Melbourne, this occurred. A former Assemblies of God church was sold to a Hindu outfit, and it is now a Hindu sanctuary. Now, because it's unthinkable to me that Joshua would have set the Ark of the Covenant in front of a huge crowd of Israelite leaders there at Shechem, which would have meant instant death to anybody who viewed it, I suspect that the Ark was either brought to the former sanctuary of Baal and put behind a curtain there in a more or less proper manner, or it wasn't brought at all. It remained in Shiloh. Therefore, what would have happened is the Baal-Berith sanctuary was simply rededicated to the name of Jehovah, and therefore it was called the sanctuary of Jehovah. And thus the reason for this statement at the end of verse 26. Now, while I think that it is the most likely possibility, I readily admit that I cannot prove this, but I assure you that I'm hardly alone in thinking that this rededication from a Baal sanctuary to a sanctuary of the God of Israel is the most likely scenario. Let's reread the last few verses of Joshua chapter 24. We'll start at verse 29. After this, Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of Adonai, died. He was 110 years old, and they buried him on his property in Timnath Serach, which is in the hills of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. Israel served Adonai throughout Joshua's lifetime and throughout the lifetimes of the leaders who outlived Joshua and had known all the deeds that Adonai had done on behalf of Israel. The bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel had brought up from Egypt, they buried in Shechem, in the parcel of ground which Jacob had brought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, and they became a possession of the descendants of Joseph. Finally, Eleazar, the son of Aaron, died, and they buried him on the hill belonging to Pinchas his son, which had been given to him in the hills of Ephraim. Joshua dies at 110 years of age. Now, do not at all think that this means precisely 110 years or that he died on his 110th birthday. He might have been a few months shy of 110, or even a few months older, but 110 is a significant number because down in Egypt, 110 was seen among the Egyptians as the symbolic age of having lived an extraordinary lifespan. However, we also saw that Moses died at 120 years of age. And that is the number of years that God says in the Torah is man's symbolic age of blessed and fullest lifespan. The difference between the two in lifespans makes it clear that Joshua had not attained Moses' status in God's eyes, but he was just a notch below. Well, we also find a very significant honor bestowed upon Joshua at his death that had not been given to him during his life. He was called a servant of Jehovah. Now, this was a title that belonged supremely to Moses. It was a rare one. And when Joshua was Moses' assistant, and he finally took over the leadership role of Israel upon Moses' death, Joshua was given the title the servant of Moses. Only now, as an epitaph, is the title servant of Jehovah transferred to Joshua. So from servant of Moses to servant of Jehovah. Now, the influence of Joshua upon Israel was simply enormous. His example of leadership is unmatched in the Old Testament. In reality, the later story of King Solomon is the story of an anti-Joshua. It's the example of the worst kind of leadership. Joshua poured his life out into his people and into preparing the next generation of leaders. The passage in verse 31 makes it clear that immediately following his death, Israel was well governed by those he had mentored. And as a result, Israel served the Lord in a manner that seems to have pleased him. And although we now get a quick note that the remains of Joseph that had been brought with them on their exodus from Egypt were buried at Shechem, this really is an anachronistic statement. In other words, this is a statement that makes it appear that Joseph was buried only now, the same time Joshua died. Rather, his interment with his ancestors would have been one of the very first acts that the leaders of Israel would have done upon arriving in the Promised Land. It's only that the editor of Joshua has noticed that to this point, this wonderfully important figure of Israel's salvation history has not had the announcement of his proper burial posted. So he chose this spot to mention it. Well, after Joshua died, the current high priest, Eleazar, also passed away. Now, we don't know exactly how long after Joshua passed that Eleazar died. And Pinchas his son was now the new high priest of Israel. It's appropriate for us to close this book on this golden era of conquest and obedience of God's people because on this kind of a note, because now we have both the secular and the religious leaders of the conquest era put into their graves. It's over. The page is being turned. The next historical era of Israel is, unfortunately, not as glorious as the one just ended. It is called the era of the judges, or in Hebrew, the Shoftim. And there was no Joshua-like figure to guide Israel. The priesthood was supposed to function in that manner to a degree, and each tribal leader was to emulate Joshua. They did not. Rather, each did what was best in his own eyes. And Israel was going to pay a terrible price for it. Next up is the book of Judges.